Hi, I'm Dr. David Roth. I'm a triple boarded physician in pediatrics, adult psychiatry and neurology, and child and adolescent psychiatry. And I'm in both private practice here in Honolulu, as well as clinical director for the Child and Adolescent Division of the Department of Health. What I've seen with my work with children, adolescents, and adults with autism spectrum disorders is that they have a particular learning style and memory style. And it's similar to PTSD because there's that loop, the concept of re-experiencing, relearning, and re-understanding. The window into the autistic child's world is really through the echolalia, that symptom that's very common, how they repeat things over and over again. And sometimes when they play, they'll play the same thing over and over again in their play. And that, in my opinion, is a window into how their mind works, how they repeat things in their mind and learn by those small snippets of information or memory, going over it again and again. And in PTSD, one of the neurological effects we see is the people who develop it get stuck re-experiencing, relearning, and re-understanding, reliving that memory over and over and over again, to the point that it actually changes their neurology. And we can see that on functional brain scans, how those parts of the brains are persistently hyperactive, and thus producing some of the symptoms that overlap between PTSD and autistic thought process. People who have autism spectrum disorders, as well as people who have been significantly traumatized, share in their response to environmental stimuli a difficulty filtering out information that is not important. All of us prioritize the information that we're receiving at any given moment. All the sensory stimulation that is input into our brain unconsciously is usually processed at that level, and we simply react to it and only react to the important things that are important to us. When that filtering process is impaired, in either an autism spectrum disorder case or a PTSD case, the reaction to that filtering of data is impaired, and they receive too much of the data, become overwhelmed, and then utilize the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, to either escape the situation or change it rapidly or shut down in a protective way. The ones who are least impaired or least overwhelmed may reach out to others for help, but if they're too overwhelmed, that capacity is undermined. When people experience post-traumatic stress disorder, they wire in response to the trauma, and their brain changes to be able to survive the traumatic environment. But being wired for survival is not the same as being wired for regular living. And that's where the hypervigilance, the outbursts of anger, the promotion of fight or flight gets in the way of regular life. So when a child, through PTSD or through their autistic wiring, is always in that hypervigilant fight or flight mode, it makes it very hard to participate in regular life stuff. Everything becomes a risk, everything becomes a threat. They're always on the lookout for problems, and anything that's out of the routine may trigger an aggressive fight or flight response, and as a way of protecting themselves, and that gets in the way of learning, which requires novelty and being exposed to new things. It gets in the way of friendships because you don't want to meet a new person, and it gets in the way of new tasks and new skill building, which is a normal part of education. So the autistic child often has difficulty with self-regulation. This is usually an unconscious, automatic, autonomic nervous system function. Most of us regulate ourselves without consciously trying to adapt to our circumstance. When it rises to our awareness, it's a big deal. And so when you shift gears from church to a football game, you do it automatically. But for them, it requires a lot of thought, a lot of preparation, and a lot of self-monitoring and self-regulation that many have difficulty doing all the time. And so when the autistic child fails to self-regulate, then they move into a fight or flight mode. And that's where you'll see the stims, the automatic movements, whether it's hand flapping or hurting oneself, banging a head, hitting oneself. You'll see escape behaviors like running away. You'll see aggressive behaviors like biting, kicking, throwing things. Or you'll see a shutdown where the child will stop responding to us and really go inward and seem to be shutting down verbally, emotionally, and sometimes physically recoiling into more of a safety position. The point you make about families who are raising these children, or families who are living with a traumatized veteran, that they're in a state of hypervigilance, is a very important one, because the people who are close to the traumatized individual need to be able to stay well regulated to then provide a regulation to the other. And so this is the accessory brain concept that I talk about, and I have my friend Yorick here, that we've seen with the work of Dan Siegel and others, that when one brain is working well, it can affect a nearby brain, and that people do regulate each other. It goes back to the maternal-child bond, that when the mother is upset, the child feels it. The child didn't understand anything the mother said, the infant especially. But that regulation, that physiological response is transmitted to the close-by person. So when we train teachers and staff with our brain train approach, it's about regulating oneself so that as the youth who's dysregulating is starting to lose control, we stay in control, we stay calm and focused, and we're able to help regulate the other person. Western medicine, as we understand diagnoses and diseases, is based on a concept of an identifiable disease. It's very much an infectious disease model of understanding things, but the body isn't that simple. Unless something specifically has happened to cause a reaction, it's usually a spectrum of our ability to respond to the environment. And if we have a maladaptive response, then there's a progression in how badly we can respond to it. So people who have native impairments are on a similar spectrum, that people's ability in sports or people's ability in math is on a spectrum. A, B, and C students is a good example. So the neurology that underlies the difficulty of people who have autism and mental retardation and learning disabilities is on a continuum, because people don't have just a specific problem. It usually overlaps and is usually intrinsic to just that person, and can be best understood as part of a spectrum of need, ability, or disability. Well, the brain, like any other part of the body, succumbs to the old principle: if you don't use it, you lose it. So any capacity that you nurture and develop as a child then needs to continue to be nurtured and developed as an adult, or else we have a regression in skills. And all of us have that. Many of us took high levels of math in high school or college, but would be really tasked to do any of that math homework right now. So the brain responds to challenges, and the more you exercise skill sets of mental acuity, the better those skill sets will become. And as we age, that's increasingly important. We've seen that novelty and exposure to new circumstances and new thoughts and new patterns improves people's mental capacity with dementia. And I've seen it in my own 92-year-old grandmother, that when there's something different, she's so much brighter, so much better, and so much more vibrant and sharp compared to when she's in her routines. And so the way I've kind of conceptualized some of the neurology research is old dogs can learn new tricks. They just need more biscuits. The capacity to generate new neurons and new connections continues from birth till death. It's just a little harder for those of us who are past 25. One of the things that's interesting about the way we treat our children and adolescents who have these kind of intellectual or developmental disabilities, school is all focused about learning and maximizing their capacity until we're finished with the educational span, which, for most kids, according to the laws that govern education, is around age 20 or 21. And then you transition to the adult system, which tends to move towards adaptive living skills and trying to make sure they're as functional and capable of functioning for themselves as possible in modified or unmodified environments. And so you have to keep challenging people to retain the skills that aren't reinforced naturally in their environment. So my example of, doing math that we studied years ago, we would have to do a refresher course if we haven't kept using it. And if we have been using it, we can build upon it. So there certainly would be a regression or a loss of skills, but we tend, as they move into adulthood, focus on other kinds of skills and are constantly trying to reinforce and expand that skill set. One of the things we can do with technology is control the amount of data that the subject is exposed to. So specifically, In the regular world, you have sights and sounds and smells and textures, but in a virtual reality world, we can control how much data is being presented to the individual and help them learn how to adapt to that smaller modified data set. And then as they gain more competence and become more comfortable with it, extrapolate it out to more and more complicated real world like situations until they can finally have a sense of mastery in the real world and know how to properly filter all that sensory information, all that cognitive awareness, and be able to respond to it in a way that serves their needs and is congruent with the expectations of others. When we are able to break things down and present it in a simpler form, it's easier for people to understand. If you think about how you teach readings to a small child, it's A is for apple, and you have a picture of an apple, the letter A. We've simplified it. We don't teach them by reading them a whole passage. Smaller chunks, smaller amount of information to process. The less information, the less overwhelmed, and therefore a greater capacity for learning. The social rhythm therapy program that we've run for several years is a program that we designed for the higher functioning kids with autism spectrum disorders. The lower functioning kids do well with behavioralism. The next group up can handle some scripting, but the really smart ones need to understand the reasons for behavior, the reasons for social interchange. When you give a handshake, why? What are the rules for it? What does it mean? So we chose to teach to that group, and by breaking these complex social interactions down into the constituent parts and patterns, we were able to teach them what these things are, what they mean, how to use them, and therefore in real life situations they were able to extrapolate and employ them without being overwhelmed by all the data. The social program that we developed would help with those kind of advanced adaptive living skills like obtaining a job or functioning at a job, because you run through a script too quickly and you don't have the ability to adapt your script to real life situations. This model goes with strategies, and with strategies you understand how to apply yourself to different situations. And so there's more confidence, there's more competence, and therefore more ability to actually perform more complicated and varied tasks. The technology, whether it's on web initiatives or apps on the phone or iPads or other devices, the capacity to take a large chunk of information and be able to break it down so an individual can learn it at their capacity, at their speed, and maintain a positive learning environment because they're not overwhelmed. That is a huge asset, because the normal educational system struggles with individualizing education. But the technology would free us up to really individualize it, not only in the material, but the pace at which they master it. And then the last part is the socialization through the social networking component. Imagine, if you will, a program where they're mastering these ideas and skills, and then they're eligible to practice with peers across the country who have also just mastered that skill set without the overwhelming stimulation of meeting with them and driving to a new place and trying to coordinate schedules. That would be overwhelming for families and for the youth. And the technology we have of social networking and video conferencing really would make that possible and allow people at many different levels of capacity to find a cohort to connect with and to learn with.